Unlike the previous speakers, I'm not going to give you a description of either ongoing or past research that I've been involved in, or indeed applies, if you like, in this big data context. But I do want to talk a little bit about, and perhaps characterize for you, something called geographical health information systems. And could I just briefly engage you by asking how many of you have never heard of or not heard of geographical information systems? Oh, that's quite a few, in fact. A few years ago, I used to put that around the other way. How many of you have heard of geographical information systems? And almost no one would have done. Okay, so some of the slides I'm going to show you now will be particularly of interest to those of you who haven't come across it before. And my purpose in this talk is to just embed geographical information systems within geographical health information systems. If you like, show you the different ways in which GIS, let's call it that for short, has been used, has potential use within the health field. And we've seen some rather nice examples of the way in which mapped data can be very useful and important within the context of different types of research. And I am, as a geographer, I'm deeply ashamed of some of the maps and diagrams I'm going to show you in comparison with some that we've seen this afternoon. But, well, I won't go into that. Okay, so what is a geographical information system, or GIS? Well, quite simply, it's a computer system for storing, integrating, retrieving, displaying, and analyzing geographical data. A few years ago, and to some extent, of course, it's still the case, that a GIS comprises three key components. It comprises the software, some of which would be open source, some of which would be commercial. There's a list there of some of the most well-known open source and commercial software. The hardware, of course, computers, scanners, printers, etc., etc. And of course, the skilled people who could make make that system sing. Of course, due to the internet, and in a sense we've seen examples of this in some of the presentations, GIS activities are becoming increasingly distributed, and this includes accessing and sharing data, online processing of data. You can submit your request to a remote location, and there will be a facility which will process that data in ways that you request. And of course, location-based services as well. The example of that, not in a health context, is you've come to a strange town and you would like to know where all the restaurants are. Well, in a way, those sorts of things have a link with GIS. And things that are often referred to as map mashups, that is where you bring data together on a common framework. And of course, in this case, it is a GIS, a map-based system, and what you're doing is bringing together data from multiple sources that perhaps in the ordinary wouldn't talk to one another or wouldn't know about one another, but can bring them together in that way. What is the geography in GIS? Well, the geography in GIS, which sometimes upsets some of my more cultural and behavioral colleagues, is that it's quite cold. Every piece of data must have a geocoding, and different attributes are held in data layers in the form of either points, lines, or polygons. And to the extent that geography as a subject is concerned with the attributes of places and the relationships, the spatial relationships between those places, such as distance, nearness, and adjacency, a GIS is capable of capturing both of those aspects of geography. Now, within a GIS, or in many cases external to a GIS, you need appropriate tools to analyze that data, and these fall broadly, and I do mean broadly, into three categories: statistical, mathematical, and cartographical. And I'm going to show you examples of all of those as I now proceed with that background. Oh, that's just a map showing you in a very schematic way the different layers which the data that one stores within the GIS might be stored, so that each of those layers can be switched on, switched off as one explores the relationships between those data. Okay, which then brings me on quite quickly to geographical health information systems, which are simply GISs adapted to the needs of health research and health-related policy. And a sort of very crude classification or categorization of GHISs is, as I've suggested here, spatial epidemiology, to support health service provision and emergency response. And the third, which is only really beginning to take off in the last few years, community-focused or community-based GIS, of which I will say a little bit at the end. So let me start then by taking the first of those. What characterizes the spatial epidemiological use of GIS, which, as I say, I'm referring to broadly as GHIS. It was one of the earliest uses of GIS in health research, and basically the activity that goes on within the GIS is to integrate the different sets of data which are necessary within the context of the research being proposed, or the analysis that's being proposed. So the data sets might involve health data, demography, social, economic, environmental data sets. Providing the data has a geocoding, it can go into a GIS. And the kinds of facilities that you would see within a spatial epidemiological context for GHIS facilitates those three principal activities. First of all, the construction of maps of, let's say, disease rates to reveal patterns and give visual clues about the geography of the disease or whatever it is one's looking at. A second very important component is cluster detection, identifying unusual concentrations, suggesting possible relationships between those concentrations and possible environmental or social or demographic characteristics. And then finally, small area ecological analysis, which may in certain circumstances give useful clues, especially those clues that might be linked to the environment, the physical environment in particular that might be responsible. Now, typically this spatial epidemiology use of GIS, subcategory of GHIS, draws on the field of spatial statistics. And this, I'm certainly not going to talk about spatial statistics except to say this is an area of statistics that recognizes the fact that geographical or spatial data do not meet the sort of traditional expectations of independent data, so that you need to use specialist software in order to fit models, to carry out analyses which recognize the spatial structure of the data, and from a purely statistical point of view, the non-independence of the data if one is testing hypotheses. Now, in each of those three categories that I refer to, mapping, cluster detection, and ecological analysis, mapping these days typically uses what are called borrowing strength methods. And this, if you like, exploits a positive feature of spatial dependence. That is, the ability to draw in data locally in order to improve the precision of the estimates that one may be seeking to present through map form. Cluster detection methods, including kernel density smoothing and use of scan statistics, typically move windows, small windows across a map, and compute statistics within each of those windows, and then come forward with some summary display or summary of the map pattern. And there's an example of the use of kernel density smoothing to draw out potential clusters of cases from a map. And what lies behind that technique is, if you like, a window smoothing process. And then finally, ecological analysis, typically using regression methods, particularly Poisson regression with spatial random effects in order to try to explain the variation that's observed within the disease rates. Now, just as an aside, we teach our students both at the undergraduate level and the postgraduate level about the use of these spatial analytical techniques. And for those of you who may be involved in this kind of thing, you might like to know about JIDA, which is a very user-friendly point-and-click package which allows you to demonstrate and for the students to work within this kind of methodology. For more advanced work, one's looking at R, Winbugs, Stater, and so forth. Okay, let me move on very quickly then to geographic health information systems for decision support and health service provision, particularly in emergency response. These fall broadly into two categories: location modeling for a new service or improvements to an existing service, where to site a new facility, for example, which will best meet the needs of a spatially distributed population. Or designing a system to respond to some environmental disaster, for example, identifying places most at risk from an extreme environmental event and how responses might be structured to minimize the damage, the effect on the population of that event. And this, again, I apologize for the quality of the map, but this again tries to capture this notion of combining different types of data. And as I said, it's a very cold geography. It's point lines and polygons, in which the polygons capture the geography of risk across that map. The lines are referring to lines of evacuation roads and so forth, and the points are certain service points within that region. This was an example of something that was developed as a measure of how emergency response could have been was put in place in respect to South Carolina. Okay, conscious of time running on, GIS functionality, which is most useful in this context, includes network and locational analysis, connectivity, shortest path, routing, etc., etc. These are broadly mathematical tools and techniques which can be utilized to solve problems in relation to meeting service targets. Then the last category, community-oriented GIS. In a way, what I've shown you so far are what you might call aspects of GIS, GHIS, Geographical Health Information Systems, for experts who will utilize the system, will derive results from that, and will embed them or bring them forward into policy making or wider use. Community-oriented GIS, which is growing quite rapidly, recognizes the importance, if you like, of two-way flows of information. And whereas the two examples that I showed you before are quite statistical or mathematical in nature, these tend to stress more qualitative methods and is often referred to as qualitative GIS. So, for example, and we saw quite a good example of that in the previous talk, tapping community knowledge through community-based participatory activity, disseminating and transferring health information knowledge to a community and getting reactions back. In fact, using community information, a two-way flow of information, to strengthen the tailoring and targeting, the geographical tailoring, the geographical targeting of health service activity. And here's just a very simple example of the sort of thing that I have in mind. It's map-based. It's a qualitative, community-centered GIS which combines diverse types of data that includes, and although it might be a little bit difficult for you to see, data including photographs, field notes, audio recordings, and hyperlinks to external sources. But if there has been a growing trend, if you like, in the GIS field, it's wider participation. It's not one-way flow from the experts to those who are on the receiving end, but it's a communication, if you like. It's a dialogue between health service providers and the communities that are on the receiving end. So I hope in that short talk I've given you some idea of how geographic health information systems, a sort of rough categorization of the kinds of systems that you might see. What's the take-home message? Well, you can read as well as I can, but the idea that I want to get across here is the potential role in a number of different contexts of GIS, geographic information systems, adapted or attuned to the needs of health service delivery, the study of disease, and other forms of health service activity, the potential role that GIS can play within that. So thanks very much, and I hope I've kept the time.
Well, thank you very much indeed. Again, while we're changing over, are there any quick questions?
Sheila Bird from the Analysis of Biostatistics, presumably shortest path analysis could be either shortest road network or shortest time on road network, and you might get different connectivity maps with the two metrics.
Absolutely right. I think we had a previous presentation this morning about access, and access can be measured in a variety of different ways. And whilst there is clearly how can I put it, a kind of emphasis on physical access in terms of geography, spatial proximity, it's not. It's entirely possible to embed within those different links the time it takes to travel along them and to include that within the way in which you measure shortest path.
Great. Well, thanks, Aaron.
Thank you.